Hi, this is John Cullen. In this episode of Just the Facts, we're going to fact check Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan. I'm recording this show on Saturday, the 1st of May, 2021. And in the past week, Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan have stirred up quite a bit of controversy.
All right, children, welcome back to class. I'm your new teacher, Detective Harris, and this is our homeroom teacher's assistant, Officer Johnson. Let's start the day off with some math. Does anyone understand math? Who would like to lead the class with some math?
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. On Friday, Joe Biden participated in a kind of summit with more than a dozen other world leaders. They were all there, including the guy who runs France. The meeting itself turned out to be only marginally interesting. What got your attention was Joe Biden. Of the 16 heads of state who were present, only Joe Biden wore a face mask. Joe Rogan, over on the podcast, voiced his concern on the air the other day, and here's what he said.
People say, do you think it's safe to get vaccinated? I've said, yeah, I think for the most part it's safe to get vaccinated. I do. But if you're like 21 years old.
So I thought in this episode what we might do is take a look at some of the facts. And like in most of the shows that we do, I'll be citing facts directly from the CDC. Now, there are new interim public health recommendations that just came out from the CDC on April 27th. 2021. So what I'd like you guys to do is check with the CDC, go to the CDC website and take a look at their new recommendation. I'm not a doctor and we don't make any recommendations on the show. This is entertainment. This is like bad comedy, right? So I'm going to be commenting on news stories and reading news stories and then making snarky comments that is just bad comedy. And obviously, I'm a parody of some kind of a news character.
I hope you like techno thrillers because I'm about to tell you a ripping yarn about WikiLeaks and their founder, albino matchstick Julian Assange. You may not know that WikiLeaks is protected by a global hacker nerd brigade known as Anonymous, whose commitment to openness and free exchange of information is right there in the name. Anonymous attacks whoever attacks WikiLeaks. Now, WikiLeaks claims they have incriminating files from a major U.S. bank proving corporate malfeasance. Some speculate that's Bank of America, mostly because Bank of America says, that sounds like us.
All right, let's take a look at what Rochelle Walensky has to say. Rochelle Walensky is the new head of the CDC. And according to Rochelle Walensky, says this is reported by CNBC, and this was reported by Rich Mendez. And this story came out on April 19th. So this is about 2 weeks old. But as of about 2 weeks ago, according to the CDC says fewer than 6,000 Americans have contracted COVID after being fully vaccinated. That's very promising. So we go to the key points. U.S. health officials have confirmed fewer than 6,000 cases of COVID-19 in fully vaccinated Americans, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky said. That represents just 0.007% of the 84 million Americans with full protection against the virus. The CDC chief acknowledged that the number could be an underestimate. So there's that. What we do on this show is something called quantitative analysis. Using mathematics and statistics, regression analysis, we're looking at different patterns and numbers, and that's part of my background and my expertise. But we don't give any advice, so we're just analyzing information that the CDC and the WHO and Johns Hopkins makes available, and in some cases we also reference worldometers.info. But as far as advice, we recommend that you go directly to the manufacturer's websites. Go to Pfizer, go to Moderna, go to J&J, go to the FDA, go to the CDC, go to the WHO. Those are your official sources, right? Not me, not Joe Rogan, right? Not Charles Barkley, right? We should not be your official sources. We're just guys with dumb opinions, right? So don't listen to us. Go to these places and refer to what they have to say, right? So this is the Pfizer website, and this is, what they have to say about their vaccine. So that's what you want to do, is go to the FDA website, go to the CDC website, go to Pfizer, go to Moderna, and get it right from the source. Stop listening to all these other kooks out there. This is the Moderna website. So if you go to the Moderna website, you can read all about it right there. Okay? So go to the CDC, go to the FDA, go to Pfizer, go to Moderna. Those are your definitive sources. Okay? All right. If you're a subscriber to this channel, you're probably familiar with this. This is the pneumonia and influenza mortality surveillance system. It's from the National Center for Health Statistics, and it's called the Mortality Surveillance System. And recently, COVID-19 was added to it. So this system's been used for years to track influenza, pneumonia and influenza, PNI. The name of the system is FluView, and I've been using FluView for about a year to track the influenza outbreak in the United States. This is the pneumonia and influenza mortality surveillance from the National Center for Health Statistics Mortality Surveillance System. And it's going to show us pneumonia and influenza, which is PNI, and now it can show us pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19 side by side. And this is really helpful, actually. I'm not sure why they changed the system and why they're conflating data between influenza and COVID-19. But because this system was used for so many years to track PNI, we can baseline the PNI. And when we do that, we see this. So when I look at multiple years of PNI deaths, going back to October of 2016, all the way on the left of this chart, you see that the peak in the middle of that 2017 season that Dr. Fauci talked about looks like it's coming just about up to the 7,500 per week level, about 7,000 deaths per week. And he said that was really the worst flu season we've had in a long time. We had about 80,000 people die. And that's the October 2017. You see the number 40 above that? That's the week number in the calendar year. So when we get to week 40 in the calendar year, that's October 1st. So at that point, there's now 12 weeks left. So we've got October, November, December remaining in the year. And then you'll see number 1 to the right of that. That's the first week of the year. That's January 1st. This represents October 2016 through January of 2020. And you'll see that as you get close to, maybe it's week 8, 9, 10 of 2020, there's a little bit of green that starts to show up, and that's COVID. So those are the COVID deaths. But for 4 years prior, this is what P&I deaths look like in the United States. Now, the first thing I want to take a look at, this is quantitative analysis. This is doing math using the CDC's feed. And this is coming from the CDC website. I'll show you exactly where I'm getting this in just a moment. In fact, we were just there. That was the website where this data just came from. I'll show you how I get it in a moment. All right, so let's go to the next slide. On the next slide, you're going to look at multiple years of influenza, but now, instead of stopping right before the COVID outbreak, now I want you to see the 2020 portion. So this now is going to include all of 2020 and the 2020-2021 season on the next slide. So this is going to be everything that's on this current slide and all of 2020 and 2021, but no COVID. So this is going to be just P&I. Now, the first thing that jumps out at me when I look at this is that as bad as the October 2017 outbreak was, which is now towards the left-hand side of the graph, when we talked about it was approaching 7,500 deaths per week, it appears that when we got to week 14 in 2020, it went way beyond 7,500 a week. And then it looks like it went past 10,000, approaching 15, came back down. We see this W shape to the death chart. And then after week 40, it goes back up again. So the beginning of influenza season, October 1st, week 40, you see that in the United States, deaths go beyond 7,500, beyond 10,000 a week, beyond 15,000 a week. And this is P&I. Now, we're going to look at COVID in a minute, but because they're now in the same system and they're side by side, now we can compare them side by side, and that makes this a whole lot easier. So now let's look at influenza P&I deaths next to COVID. So now let's add the COVID to this multi-year perspective. What does it look like? It looks like that. So the COVID now is the green stuff. And what you can see here, let me see if you guys can see this if I do this. All right, the green is the COVID. The blue is the influenza. And what you'll see is that down here in these little valleys, the influenza deaths outnumbered the COVID deaths. But in the peaks, COVID was outnumbering influenza. So COVID was getting all the headlines in both of these peaks. But then there's a couple weeks recently where you see the blue is bigger than the green, meaning influenza deaths have outnumbered COVID deaths for that week. So wherever you see the blue higher than the green, it means that P&I deaths outnumbered COVID deaths for that week. Now, these deaths in green, these COVID deaths, these are all deaths with COVID. All right, so we're not breaking out any of the comorbidities yet. So this is all deaths with COVID versus P&I deaths for multiple years. All right, so what you're seeing here is that the P&I portion, going back to October 2016, there's your 2017 horrible season that Dr. Fauci talks about with 80,000 people dying, but it never really got to 7,500 a week. We see 7,500 people a week dying in the United States from P&I in, it looks like week 14 or 15. And then it goes up beyond 10,000 and then broaches 15,000 per week around the new year. So the last couple weeks of December and January, we have over 15,000 people dying in the United States. Now, this is according to the CDC, right? Let's go back to that website. Let me take you back to the browser. All right, so I'm getting this data here. And the way I get this data is pretty simple. If you see this little pull-down menu here, and it has all the years, 2016, 17, 17 to 18, everything is checked. I leave everything checked for what I'm doing right now. And rather than look at P&I, up here on the top, there's two radio buttons. One on the left says pneumonia and influenza, P&I, and the other says pneumonia and influenza and COVID, PIC. Now we're just going to hit download. And when I hit download, it's going to send that data to us. And I'm going to hit download data, and then we can open this in a spreadsheet formula. And that's what I do. So that's how this works. So the charts that I'm showing you here just came from that download. All I do is run it through the charting software. And I'm simply using the stuff that comes with the Mac for free, whatever that's called, numbers, I guess. So I'm using numbers to do this. So you're looking at multiple years, right? And the heading on the chart is the same as the heading from the website. So whatever the website page just said at the top, I copy and paste that. And that's it. So what you're seeing here is that in the worst flu season that Dr. Fauci talks about, with 80,000 people died, we don't appear to have reached 7,500 deaths a week. But in week 14 or so, 14 or 15 of 2020, it goes past 7,500, past 10,000. These are big numbers up here, and comes back down, and then goes past 15,000 people a week around the last week of December, the first week in January of 2020, 2021. So this is the aspect of the story that I've been focused on, which is the influenza part, the P&I part. But then we add in the coronavirus part, right? And, you know, they're different. They're obviously different. So coronavirus is one thing. Influenza is another thing. And there's such a thing as having a co-infection, right? So you can be infected with coronavirus and herpes. You can be infected with coronavirus and zoster virus. It can happen. I can get both at the same time. Things like that happen. So you can have two outbreaks of two different things at the same time. For example, is there a norovirus outbreak right now around the world? Sure. What about tuberculosis? Is tuberculosis killing people right now? Sure. Of course. Would it be possible for someone to have tuberculosis and contract coronavirus? Yes, of course. Why not? Why would you not, if you were already sick with tuberculosis, you don't think that you are ripe to also catch coronavirus for a co-infection? Why not? That's just a question, right? That's not medical advice or anything like that. It's just a dumb question. So let's go to the next slide. Now here, what I've done is now we're going to start talking about the comorbidities. So the green represents the COVID deaths, but that's deaths from all deaths with COVID. The blue are the P&I deaths, right? And I think the point I'm trying to make here is that every week in the United States, people die from pneumonia and influenza. Yes, there is a season, but the season doesn't really end. It just runs one into the other. You go from week 40 to week 40, and that's a season. They say that, the season usually ends at the end of April or so, but that doesn't mean people stop dying. It just means they stop freaking out about it. But through the summer or whatever, people continue to die. So people are always dying from P&I. Always. It doesn't stop. Ever. And coming into the coronavirus outbreak, we started to see more than 4,000 people a week dying from influenza every single week of 2020. So starting the first week of 2020, 4,000 something, 4,000 and change every single week. It does not go below 4,000 at any point in all of 2020. That has never happened in history. There's never been a year where 4,000 people died from P&I every single week. That's never happened. Now, at the same time, we're logging coronavirus deaths. And what you see is coronavirus kind of comes on in week 11, 12, 13, 14, and then starts to peak and eclipses the influenza deaths about the third or fourth week into it. But if we go to the CDC's mortality page, let's do that. Let's go to the browser now. So this is the CDC's website. This is cdc.gov. And we're looking at weekly updates by select demographic and geographic characteristics. And let me just refresh it so that we're looking at the most recent data. All right. And you see it has a list of topics: sex and age, race and Hispanic origin, place of death, comorbidities and other conditions. And that's what I want. So I'm going to comorbidities and other conditions. And allow me to read this to you if I can. So we're at cdc.gov. Comorbidities and other conditions. Table 3 shows the types of health conditions and contributing causes mentioned in conjunction with deaths involving coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19. The number of deaths that mention one or more of the conditions indicated is shown for all deaths involving COVID-19 and by age groups. For over 5% of these deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned on the death certificate. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, which would be the remaining 95%, on average, there were 4 additional conditions or causes per death. For data on deaths involving COVID-19 by time period, jurisdiction, and other conditions, click here. All right, so it says that 5%, let me highlight this, for 5% of these deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned on the death certificate. Okay, so that's the comorbidity data. Now here's the comorbidity table. And when we look at the comorbidity table, it looks like influenza, with 254,000 of these deaths, is the number one comorbidity. Right? So there's nothing else that has that big a number. Right? Respiratory failure and ARDS, adult respiratory distress syndrome, and respiratory failure. But influenza and pneumonia, 254,000, it is the single largest category here. And the total they have is 555,000. So this is all deaths with COVID. 5% of 555,000 is the number. Let me see if I can do that for you real quick. 27,750 people, roughly. So that's the number. A little about 27,500 have died with just COVID mentioned on their death certificate. Right? That's that number. The rest of the people have 4 other conditions. And you can see this at CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. National Center for Health Statistics, weekly update. And this is where you get that. Now you can look by sex and age also. So here we can look at how many people have died by age. So 0 to 17. So this is all school-age children and infants and toddlers up to 17 years old. In the United States, through the duration of the entire pandemic, 277 kids have died. And that's tragic. That is a tragic number. I want to show you how that compares to other causes of death for children in the United States. Now, this is a website called World Life Expectancy, and they categorize by 0 to 14, not 0 to 18, but 0 to 14. What we see is that there are 645 kids that have drowned up to 14 years old. So that means that the number would have to be bigger if we went all the way to 18. Right? So if we have 645 kids that drown from 0 to 14 years old, and we have 277 from 0 to 17 that have died with COVID, right? Now you see that to the right of this, it tells you that for 0 to 17 years old, not only do 277,000 people die or kids die with COVID, but 41,811 died from all sorts of stuff. Car accidents, suicides, drug overdoses, murders, whatever. So the 277, as far as how big a portion is that of this 41,811, and then here it says that 703 kids died with pneumonia. Well, that's a whole lot more than 277. At least when I went to school, it was, right? When I studied math back at the Bronx High School of Science, 703 was a larger number than 277. 277 is how many kids 0 to 17 years old have died with COVID, all deaths involving COVID, 277. Deaths involving pneumonia, 703. Now, I'm going to need to check with a math teacher to make sure that 703 is still considered a larger number than 277. It was when I was in school, but that was a long time ago. Right? Now, they've already told us how many kids died with COVID, right? 277. But all the way out to the right, they say, well, here's how many deaths involved pneumonia, influenza, or COVID. Well, P&I, pneumonia and influenza, I'm glad they're offering this. This is fascinating. But we already know how many have COVID. They just told us that over here. All deaths involving COVID for this group of kids is 277. So if I know that, can I just take the 277 away from this 1100 number? And, don't I end up with something like 800 people with P&I that died? Which is, again, I think a bigger number than 277. Again, I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. But that's what I see here at the CDC website. And I've been showing you how I take the data and then I chart it. And we've been looking at multiple years of influenza P&I deaths. And then it appears that both coronavirus and influenza took off at the same time. So the conditions must have been ripe for both of these viruses. And what we see is that this red area down in the bottom right, that I'm going to try and highlight for you here. See if you guys can see the part that's red. That's the 5%. So that's the 5% of the COVID deaths that are COVID-19 only on the death certificate are color-coded red. The green, that's all deaths with COVID. And the blue, that's P&I deaths. So 5% of COVID deaths have just COVID on the death certificate. The total number of COVID deaths per week, all deaths involving COVID, that's the green, right? And you see how that eclipses everything, right? It's clearly big, big, big. But there's a couple weeks here in the valleys where the P&I deaths are larger than the COVID deaths. And that's really important. That's how we know that the system is not double counting. If it was double counting, it would always be larger, and it wouldn't be able to go back and forth. So that tells us that it's not double counting. And then here in the last couple of weeks, we see that influenza is a little bit higher than the coronavirus. And the red down here, that's your 5%. That's the 27,500 people that died with just SARS-CoV-2, nothing else. All right, so this is just beginning October 2019 and then running into, so this is the October 2019-2020 influenza season, going into the 2020-2021 season, which, far worse than anything we've ever seen. We've never seen a season like this. Now here, the two colors are juxtaposed. Let me point that out. Here, the green, this is the influenza, and the blue is the COVID. So the big peaks here, that's COVID, not influenza. The green is the influenza coming in, 4,000 people dying a week, and then COVID eclipses the influenza. You come back down to the valley, you'll see the influenza is a little bit bigger than the COVID deaths. And then when COVID peaks, there's really no comparison up at the peaks. All right, so that's what the CDC's data looks like when you chart it. And you get to see which weeks, which virus was killing more people, basically. Now, if we were to look at, over time, deaths to date, beginning October 2019, it's a little bit unfair. So we're giving influenza a little bit of a running start here. So we have the P&I season that began October 2019. And if we start counting there, and we count deaths of P&I, and we count COVID deaths, all deaths with COVID, what do we get? And we get this. All right, so total deaths with COVID is on the right side in blue. Total P&I deaths on the left side in green. And boy, you're talking about neck and neck. That is close. All right, there are, let's see, what was the total count? 548,825 total deaths with COVID, and 527,219 P&I deaths since October October 2019. And this is unprecedented. With or without COVID, this influenza scenario here, this is just simply unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. Again, in this case, I'm telling you sort of mentally forget about the blue part of this chart for a minute. The green part, we've never had a season like this. We've never seen anything like this in history. And I can say that because I just charted the history. And I just showed you going back to 2016. So there's never been anything like what you see on the right side of the screen here. And this is looking at just the influenza portion of it. So this is historic. This has never happened. Now, we also have a situation here where Governor Pritzker has announced a $60 million campaign to combat vaccine hesitancy. And I really wish some of these governors would check in with us before they rush into these things. $60 million to combat vaccine hesitancy. Again, for anybody who's concerned about the vaccine, I don't know what Pritzker is going to spend $60 million on. I think all you need to do is, if you're hesitant, go to the sources. Now, we've talked about Pfizer, right? We've talked about Moderna. Go read what they have to say. Go read what FDA has to say. Go read what the CDC has to say. The CDC now is recommending the COVID vaccine during pregnancy. Now, this is a story from WebMD. I'm not recommending anything. Okay, we don't make recommendations here. I'm reading a story. Everybody sees that, right? CDC recommends COVID-19 vaccine during pregnancy. And this is an article by Carolyn Christ, published at WebMD, and it was published April 26, 2021. The CDC has recommended that pregnant people get a COVID-19 vaccine after new research showed that the inoculation doesn't pose additional risks for mothers or babies. The initial COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials didn't include pregnant people, but new studies with self-reported data from the vaccine rollout have suggested that the vaccines are safe and effective during pregnancy. The CDC recommends that pregnant people receive the COVID-19 vaccine. Rochelle Walensky, MD, director of the CDC, said Friday during a White House COVID-19 briefing. So that's your official stuff. So again, any questions, go to Pfizer, read what it says here at Pfizer, right? And you guys can do that yourselves. Go to Moderna, read what it says on Moderna. Go to the FDA, go to the CDC, go to the WHO. We don't give advice here. I just read stuff. All right, a couple other stories before we go fact check Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan. 6 unearthed bodies yield clues to the 1918 Spanish influenza outbreak. Frozen corpses found in Norwegian Arctic help scientists study virus. Norwegian Arctic? What? I thought we went to Breivik mission. What's going on in Norway? Cox News Service, as published at the Baltimore Sun, November 18th, it looks like, 1999. And this is 20-something years old. 6 bodies unearthed last year, that would make it 1998, in the Norwegian Arctic have unexpectedly yielded a scientific prize. They hold part of the virus that caused the Spanish influenza of 1918, which killed at least 40 million people in one of the worst disease outbreaks in history. Researchers at a scientific meeting in London said this week that they have identified fragments of the long-sought virus in the brains and organs of 6 young men who died in October 1918 on Svalbard, an island less than 800 miles from the North Pole. The bodies were unearthed in August 1998 by a multinational research team that had traveled to the Arctic in hopes of finding frozen corpses in which the flu virus had been preserved. But the bodies were found thawed and decayed, and scientific gossip during the past year had dismissed them as worthless to research. The gossip was wrong. The tissue samples that people had dismissed as so bad are yielding very good results. A jubilant Kirsty Duncan, the team's leader, said in a phone interview from London. We have fragments of the flu's genetic material, the RNA, from the lung, the kidney, the liver. Like this past week, Tucker Carlson went on a bit of a rant. And it was pretty entertaining, and at the same time, I think many people connected with the rant because it seems like he's asking a pretty logical series of questions that are continuing to go unanswered. So Breitbart covers the story, and I'm going to play for you the clip that the guys from Breitbart had served up, and what we're going to do is kind of break it down and see, are the things that Tucker's saying, are they true? We're going to fact check Tucker. And one of the things that Tucker's going to mention in this is what happened with Joe Rogan and how the, this whole cancel culture thing is already on the march for Joe Rogan. And we've got a whole story here about what a bad guy Joe Rogan is already. But let me play for you guys this video clip. Let's watch this together and see what's Tucker Carlson saying. And is Tucker right? Is he wrong? Is he citing any facts here that I can check on the fly? So let me run this clip for you.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. On Friday, Joe Biden participated in a kind of summit with more than a dozen other world leaders. They were all there, including the guy who runs France. The meeting itself turned out to be only marginally interesting. What got your attention was Joe Biden. Of the 16 heads of state who were present, only Joe Biden wore a face mask. He sat there silently, nose and mouth covered in black cloth like a rustler from an old Western, as maskless Vladimir Putin held forth on international affairs. But here was the weirdest part. That meeting took place over Zoom. None of the leaders were in the same room. They were thousands of miles from each other. So why was Joe Biden, who has been fully vaccinated, the only one wearing a mask? No one asked that question. All precautions against COVID are considered legitimate by the American news media, no matter how self-evidently lunatic they may be. Cover your face during a Zoom call. Drive to work alone with a mask on. It's all normal, says the New York Times. But then finally yesterday, our own Peter Doocy at the White House asked what the hell was going on. And here's the response he got.
Why was President Biden the only world leader at the climate summit Zoom who was wearing a mask?
Because he is sending a message to the world that he is putting in place precautions and continuing to do that as leader of the United States. And I don't know what setups they all had in their countries that may warrant some more reporting or not. But obviously he had a pool there for portions. There were additional staff there, additional personnel, and that's the sort of model that we try to keep ourselves to here.
So I want to pause there. This model that the United States and, we want to send a message to the world thing. The United States has more people dead than any country on earth, and yet is not the most populated country on earth. So how does the United States get off making any kind of statements here when we have other countries with far fewer people dead per 1,000, per million, by far, right? So if we really want to look at, who's done a great job, I know that New Zealand has won a bunch of awards, but nobody's done as good a job as Laos, right? Nobody's dead in Laos. Vietnam is 100 million people and 35 are dead. Tanzania, I think, is still in the 20s. Nigeria, with over 200 million people, has only a few over 2,000 dead. So this mask-wearing message that Jen Psaki is talking about, that we're going to send the message to the world, there's other parts of the world that have outperformed the United States rather handily. In fact, the United States has more people dead than any other country. So I'm not sure how the United States is kind of setting the tone here. That's kind of the part that confuses me. I mean, does she not know that? Does she not realize that the United States has more people dead than every other country?
Oh, well, so there you go. That's the answer. Joe Biden was sending a message to the world. And that message was not, as we had suspected, that Joe Biden has some sort of emotional disorder that makes him afraid of conference calls. No, not at all. The message, as his flack explained, is that Joe Biden is, quote, putting in place precautions. Those, of course, would be sensible precautions. Precautions against Zoom. Because it turns out that COVID is digitally transmissible. It travels through the fibers, through Wi-Fi networks. The virus embeds itself among the ones and the zeros and then springs unsuspected, teeth bared and ready to strike from any available hotspot.
That's not really true. So Tucker's being sarcastic, or he's joking. So what he's saying that SARS-CoV-2 can travel like through the microphone, it does not do that. So as a scientist, I can tell you it doesn't do that. And that he's being sarcastic or joking right now. Just to clear that up, okay? So he's not like really trying to state facts. He's being sarcastic.
Whether it's at Starbucks, down in your basement rec room, even in the Oval Office, digital COVID could be anywhere. Where there's an internet connection, there's a pandemic. So mask up on those Zoom calls, ladies and gentlemen. YouTube and online backgammon, too. We're kidding, of course. If that were true, we'd be super spreaders, given we're in the digital media business, and we would hate to bear that burden. In the end, the White House never really did explain why Joe Biden was wearing a face mask on a Zoom call after getting fully vaccinated. You're not supposed to ask. You're supposed to accept that. It's a good thing. Shut up.
This is sort of the heart of the matter here, which is that Joe Biden was already vaccinated, I think back in December, before he was sworn in. So Joe Biden's fully vaccinated. So that's sort of the heart of the story here. If you don't know that Joe Biden's fully vaccinated, then you might understand why he's wearing a mask. But Tucker's point is, if Joe Biden has been fully vaccinated, then he should be, at this point, immune to the virus. And what that means is he not only can he not get it, he can't give it to anybody, right? Like polio. I had the polio vaccine as a child. So I'm not going to get polio. I'm not going to give anybody polio. We know that, right? I mean, it should be very similar. And I think that's what Tucker's trying to say here. But if you don't know that Joe Biden has already been vaccinated, that, this could get lost on you. So Joe Biden's been vaccinated. So this is why Tucker's confused.
Good thing. Shut up. Just like you're not supposed to ask questions about why children are being forced to wear face masks while they exercise outside. That doesn't make sense. In fact, it's dangerous. Kids are not at great risk from COVID.
Kids are not at great risk from COVID. So Tucker Carlson just said that kids are not at great risk from COVID. Now, is that true? Let's fact check that. Let's go to the browser. And let's see what we have on kids. All right. So we're back at the CDC's website, National Center for Health Statistics. And what I'm looking at now is sex and age for data on deaths involving COVID-19 among ages 0 to 18. They're available here. So let's go take a look at this, see what I can find. I'm going to show you now how I do this. All right, so it brings up this page, provisional COVID-19 deaths, focus on age, and tells you about the data set and all this monkey business. I click on export, CSV for Excel, and open. Here we go. All right, so now we've got the spreadsheet. So this just came from the CDC just this second. All right, and this is the latest data. So what we're going to see here, let me zoom in here so you guys can see this better. All right, so the data is as of April 28th, so just a couple days ago. So for the age group of 0 to 4 in the United States, there have been 100 children that have died of all sexes. From 5 to 18 years old, 227. Okay? So when Tucker Carlson says that kids aren't at great risk from dying from this disease, okay, if we're looking at school-age kids, 5 to 18, little kids, 327 total. Now, earlier, I showed you this deaths by different causes in the United States, 0 to 14. And so if we look at 0 to 14 and we look at drownings, there's 645 drownings, right? We see that road traffic accidents, 1,138 kids have died in vehicle accidents. 4,500 have died from low birth weight, excuse me. And we go down to influenza, and it says that 400 kids died from influenza. So if 401 died from influenza, and not even 300 have died from COVID, and 239 died from stroke. I mean, again, I don't understand how this isn't part of the story. It appears to me more kids are drowning than dying from COVID. More kids are dying from influenza, which is a respiratory infection, than COVID. and a similar number dying from strokes, which is outrageous. So let's go back to Tucker and let's listen more to what Tucker has to say here.
Now, no one is saying so, but consider the logic here. It doesn't make any sense. We know the vaccine works. We know that anyone who wants a vaccine in this country can get one. They've told us those two things again and again, and most of us are willing to believe that they're true. But if they are true, then why wear masks? Anyone who's afraid of getting COVID can get a vaccine, and then everyone else can return to normal life, including people who don't want to get the vaccine. The people who want it can get it, and they'll be protected. And that should be the end. So why the mask fetish? Honestly, what's the answer? Well, no one will say. Instead, the CDC has produced a new round of guidelines that are about as indecipherable as a Turkish train schedule. Next up.
All right, he's telling more jokes, but the new CDC guidelines, I have them here, and I'm going to be doing a bedtime story reading the new CDC guidelines. So yes, there's new guidelines. I'll be doing a video bedtime story on them. Stay tuned, but yes, that is true. Tucker's right about that.
Istanbul, or is it Ankara? We still don't know. According to the CDC, fully vaccinated Americans can go on maskless bike rides with other fully vaccinated bike riders. Here's the new director of the CDC bringing much needed actual science to bear on these questions. Again, why are vaccinated people, fully vaccinated people, being told to wear face masks? That's what we're wondering. And here's her answer.
And right now, it's very hard to tease apart who is vaccinated, where they are in the vaccination. So it's not just to protect themselves, but largely to protect others and really to protect the unvaccinated.
Oh, did you catch the last line? Save that on TiVo. Wearing masks is, we're quoting, really to protect the unvaccinated. Oh, there you go. That's the answer. And it's just as we guessed. The vaccine is now universally available. Everyone can get it. But because some people have chosen not to get the vaccine, the rest of us must continue to live as if we haven't gotten the vaccine either. That's the reasoning. Because some people decide not to wear seatbelts, you can't drive. That's just science. Got it? Thanks, Mom. So how do we fix this problem? The problem of people who refuse to get vaccinated, for whom we're pretending that we haven't been vaccinated either. If you've gotten the vaccine, why is other people's refusal to get the vaccine a problem for you? If the vaccine is so effective, why are the people who choose to get it mad at the people who choose not to get it? Huh? Do people who've slimmed down from gastric bypass yell at fat people on the street? You wouldn't think so. It's not really their business. Your body, your choice, remember? But your body, your choice is definitely not the standard with the COVID vaccine. With the COVID vaccine, it's your body, MSNBC's choice. Watch this guy explain.
I don't know how we get to herd immunity unless we normalize the framework around vaccine certification. Listen, we're doing it in colleges. Some organizations are doing it. We're in a global crisis. We have to reach herd immunity. And the carrot and stick of you get the vaccine, you'll be able to participate in travel, restaurants, you name it, because that's frankly easier for small businesses to adhere to.
100 years ago, a new influenza virus emerged, spread around the world, and killed 50 to 100 million people. The goal of my work is to try and understand transmission enough in order to develop and evaluate control measures. So control measures are things like closing schools, or encouraging people not to go to work when they're sick, or vaccinating people. And the aim of those control measures is to push that reproduction number, the average number of secondary cases, down below 1. And that's because if each infectious person infects less than one other person, the epidemic will decline. So that's the goal of my work. For every 40 people that got this influenza infection, one of them died. And you think, maybe that's not that bad odds, but for the most recent influenza pandemic, for each person that died, there were probably 10,000 cases, which means that this 1918 influenza pandemic was the worst pandemic in history. Here's a graph showing the weekly deaths at the time of the pandemic in New York, London, Paris, and Berlin. You can quite clearly see in the middle the major wave of the pandemic. And so all the way from North America to Europe, this pandemic was happening at the same time. And this synchronicity, this is a common feature of influenza pandemics. So not only was there this major influenza pandemic in 1918, but it was also the tail end of the First World War. And I've marked here the armistice, so the official end of the First World War, in white. So you can see here that not only was this a terrible time for Europe, but data were being collected on deaths. And this really shows that infectious diseases are a priority. And we need to collect these kind of data to understand how and why these epidemics happen. So computational and mathematical tools can be used on data like these to understand the transmission processes and how the epidemic is occurring, with the ultimate aim of trying to develop interventions, so control methods, to curtail the epidemic and to slow down transmission. If you carried on like this, with each person infecting 2, step by step, as we've shown here, by the 33rd step, you would have infected everybody on Earth. And we know that that doesn't happen. So why is it that that doesn't happen? Well, this is because you start to run out of susceptible people, so people who haven't had the infection. And this is called depletion of susceptibles. So when Spiros tries to infect her, he can't. And that means that the number infected slows down. And if this is true for other people in the population, like this, then you start to see a slowdown in the number of people infected. So this is depletion of susceptibles, and I'll show you how we incorporate these kind of processes into models of transmission. So at the beginning of an epidemic, when most people are susceptible, so they haven't had it, the probability that you meet a susceptible person is quite high. But later, as this pool is depleted, so you run out of susceptible people, it becomes less likely that you'll meet a susceptible individual.
Herd immunity? Boy, it seems like not so long ago, maybe it was back in the 50s or like last week, that using the phrase herd immunity was enough to get you yanked off the air as an anti-vaxxer. Now we're bragging about herd immunity. But again, people who've got the vaccine and are totally safe are angry at the people who haven't gotten it because somehow they're endangering the people who are already vaccinated. So to protect people who voluntarily taken the risk of not getting the vaccine, we have to hurt those people. We've got to burn the village to save the village. As the doctor on television put it, we've got to use the carrot and the stick, but especially the stick. Colleges love this idea. Many of them are requiring proof of vaccination as a condition of return to campus in the fall. In the state of California, both of the big state school systems, University of California and the Cal State system, are forcing students returning to campus to prove they've been vaccinated. Schools in New York, places like Columbia, Fordham, Syracuse, the big ones, are doing exactly the same thing. What's interesting is that no one has bothered to explain why we're doing this. Virtually no college-age kids have died of COVID. In fact, according
virtually no college-aged kids have died from COVID. So that's the claim that Tucker Carlson makes here. Virtually no college-age kids have died from COVID. All right, so I'm going to fact check that. Let's see where he goes with this. He's going to drop a number on us. Let's see if I can match up to this number.
To an April report by the CDC, a total of 587 Americans between the ages of 15 and 24 died of the virus last year. Most.
Let me play that again.
In fact, according to an April report by the CDC, a total of 587 Americans.
All right, he's saying 587. All right, let me bop over here to the browser. All right, so I just downloaded this, and this must be what he's talking about. So this is from April 28th. And here, if we look at 15 to 24-year-olds, so this is a little bit newer data than what he had. The number here is 605. So from 15 to 24 years old, which includes high school, so 15, 16, 17, 18 is high school kids, and then 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and then up to 24, I guess, for masters and whatever, 605 total in the United States. Okay, so That's what we're looking at here.
Virtually no college-age kids have died of COVID. In fact, according to an April report by the CDC, a total of 587 Americans between the ages of 15 and 24 died of the virus last year, most with profound underlying health conditions. Many times that, thousands and thousands and thousands died of suicide over the same period, which we're not concerned about. In the state of Michigan, which now requires 2-year-olds to wear masks outside.
All right, let's check his suicide claim. Let's go to the browser. Let's see. Thousands and thousands and thousands have committed suicide. Let's see. Yep, that's correct. Let's see what we've got. Let me show this to you. I'm now looking at 15 to 24-year-olds, and suicide is the #1 cause of death. 5,954 died of suicide just from 15 to 24. Add in another 546 kids that commit suicide that are younger than, up to 14 and younger. So you've got over 6,000 kids committing suicide. But, again, to me, interestingly, if you're going to go up to 24 years old, we've got over 1,000 that drown. Influenza, pneumonia, we've got 575, so about the same as the number he cited. So there's some other afflictions here that are taking larger tolls. This low birth weight is unbelievable. 4,500 infants, I imagine, are dying. Road traffic accidents, 1,138 children die, and that's just age 0 to 14. And drowning, 645 kids drown. And we talked about asthma. 152 kids died from asthma, 0 to 14, and then another 154. So it's a total of 300 kids up to 24 years old dying from asthma. And asthma is not that uncommon an affliction. So data checking Tucker so far, he's pretty much on the money.
There were just 13 coronavirus total last year for people aged 15 to 24. Compare that to overdose deaths in Michigan. It's a tiny fraction. Not that we care about those either. So the coronavirus doesn't kill a lot of young people, but it does infect quite a few of them. And that's the other problem. Many thousands of college-age kids already have been infected. They have antibodies from previous corona infections they're now recovered from. Science suggests these kids are highly unlikely to be reinfected with COVID. So why are they being forced to get the vaccine? That's a serious question. It's not an anti-vaxxer question.
Now, recently, Jason Goodman did an interview with Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Scott Jensen is running for governor in Minnesota. He's been on my show. He's been on Jason's show. And Dr. Jensen had COVID. And one of the things he explains in his interview with Jason is that because he had COVID, he now has antibodies to all the different aspects of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, meaning not just the spike proteins, but also the shell, and then also the stuff on the inside. And so he has antibodies naturally to everything, whereas I believe, and I could be wrong, that the virus basically gives you the ability to recognize the spike proteins and defend against them. And as long as you can do that, the rest of it was kind of moot. But what his point was is that he has all these different antibodies. So to Tucker's point, if you've already been infected and you've gotten better, you should have these antibodies, shouldn't you? Right? I mean, so that seems like a reasonable expectation. Is it unreasonable? Right? So somebody like President Trump. President Trump contracted coronavirus. Right? He got it. He got better. So is it safe to say, like now, that he has the antibodies, right? Would he need a vaccine against coronavirus if he's already had it and now he has the antibodies? And so I think this question that Tucker's posing is kind of a reasonable question.
That's a question people who support vaccines and care about them would ask. Because we don't give medicine to people unnecessarily. That is unethical. Meningitis, for example, kills a fair number of people every year. But we don't require everyone to start a regimen of antibiotics before they return to work. That would be crazy. It would be wrong. We wouldn't do it. But we are requiring universal vaccination even of kids who have already been infected. Is that a medically sound idea? Some physicians are concerned that it's not. Joe Rogan over on the podcast voiced his concern on the air the other day, and here's what he said.
People say, do you think it's safe to get vaccinated? I've said, yeah, I think for the most part it's safe to get vaccinated. I do. But if you're like 21 years old and you say to me, should I get vaccinated? I go, no.
Yeah.
Are you healthy? Are you a healthy person? Like, look, don't do anything stupid, but you should take care of yourself.
All right, so this is where I disagree with Joe. And I think that although Joe is not a source of advice, and you shouldn't be listening to Joe Rogan for any kind of advice other than comedic advice or how to do jiu-jitsu or something, he has an incredibly powerful sidekick and very powerful roundhouse kicks. So that, I think, can go to him for advice. But this kind of, he's just voicing his opinion. He's a dad, right? And he's saying that, if his kid was 21 years old, now the way he's saying it is he's saying if you're healthy. And one of the things, there are certain complications, right? So now if you're somebody who had COPD, or if you grew up with cystic fibrosis, so there's all kinds of factors here. And this is why I always say, just talk to your doctor. Talk to your doctor. Different people have different risks and different health profiles. And you can be healthy as can be, but you also have some condition, right? There's that actress who Sarah Hyland, who's in that show. I guess it's called Modern Family or something. I haven't seen the show, but I know her from her singing. And she's had kidney replacement surgery, right? So, there's certain things you just don't know about certain people necessarily.
We ain't never getting older. Look as good as the day I met you. I forget just why I left you. I was insane. Stay and play that Blink 182 song that we beat to death in Tucson. Okay. I know it breaks your heart. Moved to the city in a broke down car. 4 years, no calls. Now I'm looking pretty in a hotel bar. And I can't stop. No, I can't stop. So baby, pull me closer in the backseat of your Rover that I know you can.
Right, so her health has been an issue in her career. And you may not know that, right? So different people have different needs, and I think Joe's a little bit off base here saying, if you eat right and you exercise. And it's like, Sarah Hyland may have ate great and exercised plenty, but she had something wrong with her kidneys. And someone like that has a completely different risk profile from someone else. And someone like that, the vaccine might make more sense now than waiting. One of the questions that I asked Dr. Schwelt when he came on the show was if my wife wanted to wait for the full approval. Is that okay? And then we found out recently that Pfizer is seeking the full FDA approval and licensing, right? So if my wife wants to wait for that, is that a reasonable thing for her to do? And I asked that of Dr. Schwelt, right? So I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with what Joe's saying here, but let's listen further. Let's see what he has to say.
If you're a healthy person and you're exercising all the time and you're young and you're eating well, I don't think you need to worry about this.
All right, so again, I'm going to use Sarah Hyland as an example. If you're eating well and you exercise all the time and you have a kidney ailment, his advice is lousy. So, Joe, get back in the ring, do some comedy, and shut up. You don't know what you're talking about here.
Yeah, so if you're at risk, get the vaccine, protect yourself, be happy with it, be grateful we have the vaccine. And if you're not at risk, maybe you don't. Is that a crazy point? Oh, yeah, it is. That's crazy. Joe Rogan's idiotic advice. Healthy young people don't need COVID-19 vaccine. Steered a representative headline in the dailybeast.com, America's foremost defender of ruling class absurdities. You'll notice that the piece never explained why exactly Joe Rogan's advice was so idiotic. It just dismisses him as a moron. He's crazy. Don't listen to him.
I don't know how the right got so far ahead on creating
such a political connotation around the conversation about vaccine passports. There are all sorts of things you have to do to travel to all sorts of different places. How has that debate become so corrupted so early?
A couple weeks ago, we did a show where we talked about the various different amendments to the Constitution. You have the right to move freely, to move about freely, to travel freely. And freedom of movement, sort of this right to travel, is part of the Constitution. And you can't just take away people's right to move freely without due process. You have to have due process if you're going to take away rights from people. So that's kind of an issue, right? Or is it not? I don't know. I could be wrong. Let's keep going.
I don't know, but it's bad. I live in a state that is, the state legislature is dominated by Trumpers, and they are busy making it illegal for a business to require a passport, a vaccine passport. And now they're politicizing the appropriate way to encourage people to get vaccines, which will cost lives.
Although it's always challenging in society to make things mandatory, perhaps in certain employment settings, especially where there's higher risk, we may as a society decide that mandatory vaccination is a reasonable thing to do in certain circumstances.
Anyway, to recap, it's always challenging when you make things mandatory. Yeah, it's also sometimes unconstitutional and not science. But whatever, here's where we are right now.
All right, so that was Tucker Carlson and what he had to say. Now, what you're going to see is that this cancel culture has come after Joe Rogan rather aggressively. Article in Blaze Media, The Mob Comes for Joe Rogan by Steve Deese. This was published April 29th. We go over here. This is an article, Joe Rogan's COVID vaccine misinfo matters. Why bother calling out Rogan's lousy podcast take? As doctors, we know competing medical messages can be confusing and consequential. And so this article was published April 29th by Dr. Anand Swaminathan. He's the core faculty member of the St. Joseph's Regional Medical Center Emergency Department. Dr. Esther Chu, the professor of emergency medicine at Oregon Health and Science University, and Dr. Megan Ranney, the associate professor of emergency medicine and public health at Brown University. And so they go on to basically rip into Joe and tell you all the reasons, and here they quote what he says. And they say Rogan started off on the right track. The vaccines are safe. They're also highly effective, markedly reducing the risk of catching COVID-19, markedly reducing the risk of getting sick from COVID-19, and virtually eliminating the risk of dying of COVID-19. It's also true that the rate of severe illness and death in kids is lower than that in adults, and that those with chronic diseases are at higher risk for severe illness and death. And don't do anything stupid. Very sound advice that we as emergency medicine physicians heartily endorse. So they agree, don't do anything stupid. But beyond this, Rogan goes off the rails and into a sad abyss of generalizing from anecdotal personal experiences into the abandonment of pandemic mitigation principles. He acknowledges and expresses sympathy for kids who've gotten sick and died from COVID-19, but not too much, since his kids have had COVID, did just fine, and were never in agony. Based on his flawed understanding of the pandemic, he finally reaches the conclusion that healthy young people don't need to get vaccinated. This conclusion isn't just misinformed, it's potentially dangerous. Rogan failed to acknowledge that COVID-19 has already killed over 570,000 people in the U.S., far more than the around 22,000 who died from the flu in 2019-20. And although 21-year-olds are less likely to be hospitalized or to die than, say, 60-year-olds who get COVID-19, their risk is not negligible. Healthy young adults and kids have suffered greatly and died from COVID-19, and this is meaningful. Now, here in this article, it says 570,000 people have died with COVID. It says COVID has killed over 570,000 people. But when I go to the CDC's website, and we're looking at all ages, all sexes, it tells us 557,000, not the number cited in the article. So the article is citing, says over 570,000 have died, but the CDC, which is what I'm checking, is telling us 557,486. So I'm at the CDC's website. I mean, this is, I believe, the authoritative source, right? Now, you see how on the CDC's website, it shows you how many people have died per week, and you see how this is going down, 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 down? I believe Rosalind Ego calls this depletion of susceptibles. And before we had mRNA vaccines and high technology stuff like that, this is what would happen naturally, is you would have depletion of susceptibles. What they hope, I imagine, is that by using vaccines and that type of stuff, we can bring it about sooner and less people get sick, less people die. But depletion of susceptibles is sort of a natural thing, and it just takes place by itself. So, again, we're using the CDC's data, and according to the CDC, this article that's criticizing Joe Rogan, that was published by Dr. Anand Swaminathan and whatever, I forget where I saw this published. I'll find it at the end of the story, I think. But net of it is, we know who the authors are. I'm sure you guys can look this up. Anand Swaminathan is the author, and it's about Joe Rogan. The title is Joe Rogan's COVID Vaccine Misinfo Matters. I'm sorry, I clipped off the top and where I found this. But again, they're saying 570,000 people were killed by COVID. That's not true, according to the CDC. Far more than the around 22,000 who died from the flu in 2019-20. That's also not really true. This is 22,000 is something called influenza burden. And influenza burden is a calculation. That's not how many people died from the flu. Not even close. Influenza burden is something that I've done videos on. We did a bedtime story on that. And it's not how many people died from the flu. How many people died is a part of the calculation of the burden. And yes, the burden that was reported is 22,000. But way more people died from P&I in 2019-20. In fact, 274,000 people are in the mortality system that we just looked at. Right? So when we just looked at these charts just a moment ago, these charts add up to 274,000 P&I deaths, not 22,000. 22,000 is a different calculation. It's called influenza burden. So we're well aware of that. All right, so again, back to Joe Rogan. These guys are trying to fact check Joe, and it just doesn't appear that they're on top of this. So I'm not that impressed by their work. It goes on to say, and although 21-year-olds are less likely to be hospitalized or to die than, say, 60-year-olds who get COVID-19, their risk is not negligible. All right, so we're talking about 21-year-olds, and they're saying the risk is not negligible. Healthy young adults and kids have suffered greatly and died from COVID-19, and this is meaningful. Okay, but we know that more kids drown, and we know more kids died of asthma. And I think that's meaningful too. So nobody's saying it's not meaningful. Moreover, focusing on deaths is itself short-sighted. Interesting. These numbers skip casually past the physical, neurological, and emotional long-term effects of infection, even for younger adults. So if you think that getting a vaccine in order to get past the neurological and emotional long-term effects of having a respiratory infection, then you should go get the vaccine for your kids. But remember that the vaccines, right, if you go to the Pfizer site and everything, go to Moderna and read what they have to say, right? Read what it says about it. The number of children that have died from other causes, we see that COVID-19 hasn't killed as many school-age kids as asthma or drowning. So, and it appears that influenza was part of what killed more than 50% of these kids, because when we look at the comorbidities for the children, more than 50% had influenza. Okay, so that's Joe Rogan and cancel culture. And here are the 3 authors of that piece. So that's where you have that. So I thought it would be interesting to listen to what Tucker Carlson had to say, to listen to what Joe Rogan had to say, to do a little bit of fact checking, show you guys where I get the data, how I get the data, and point out that we had one heck of a ride here with 2 viruses, according to the CDC. Right? When we look at the CDC's data, according to them, in the same time frame, that 548,825 people died with COVID, not 570,000, according to that article. 527,000 died from P&I in that same period. And again, what we learned was that if we look at the portion of these charts that are just the red portion, that's the part that's just the 5%, right? And the 5% is that those are the folks that died just from SARS-CoV-2, and that's way over here on the right, just to put everything in perspective here. Okay, so these facts all come from the CDC. Everything I've been showing you in the show here comes from the CDC's website. And I'll put the links down in the comments section so that you guys can go to the CDC's websites and you can check these numbers for yourself. You can do your own downloads and you can see how the United States has been doing with influenza. And over here on the left, you see that it's showing that it's red and over threshold. And, that certainly can't be good, right? So this is influenza. I turned off COVID. So it appears that we've been over threshold for the whole season with influenza, and nobody's paying any attention to that. Once again, I'm John Cullen. Thanks for joining.